Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we'll make a start. Look, for those of you who don't know me, my name's James Torr, and I'm a director at Ipsos. Now, as you may have gathered from this opening chart, this morning's presentation for the GBI Europe launch is going to be all about trust. So, what drives trust in business, the impact that tech is having on trust, and of course, the relationship between trust and media. But look, before I go into trust, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes recapping just on the GBI audience, but also on some developments that we've made to the survey as well. A lot of you will probably be quite familiar with this chart, but look, we always get asked who are global business influencers, and it's very easy to sum it up. They're senior business people in companies with 50 plus employees. And look, they are a niche group. They represent less than 1% of the population. But if you take into account things such as their influence, their spending power, and the budgets they control, they're a disproportionately important audience for B2B marketeers, but they also represent the key to profitability for sectors such as finance, luxury goods and cars, airlines, and hotels. And as you can see from this, GBI is evolving. We're more global. So in 2018, we added the Middle East and Australia, and this year we've added Africa and India. And it takes these markets now represent, all 30, they represent about 75% of the world's GDP. And that means that we're speaking to more global business influencers year in, year out. So over 13,000 this year. And I talked about some developments as well. And what we're doing is we're giving you more insight into this important audience so you can better understand them, reach them, and communicate with them. So we're helping you, first of all, to better understand how you can engage with individual media brands. We're also helping you to identify people who influence governments, but with increased sample as well, and those people who work in charities and NGOs. We're looking at different ways to cut company size, so beyond employees. So we've added information on company turnover. And what we've seen is with tech, we've seen a massive increase in the number of trading platforms out there. So we're also asking about the number of trades that people are doing at a personal and a business level. We're taking existing information as well, and we're pre-coding it to create groups of influencers and super influencers. And this is in B2B, tech, finance, luxury, and travel. And we've got a bigger and better barometer this year. There's more data, there's the ability to cut by regions, and we can also cut by other variables such as company size and C-suite. And we're addressing key themes this year such as ESG, tech, and of course the theme of today, which is trust. But look, before I jump into trust, I suppose a bit of housekeeping if you like. There's going to be a few different data sources that I'm drawing on this morning. The first one is the main GBI data set, okay? The second is the barometer survey that I referenced on the last chart. This is an additional survey that we run alongside the main survey, and it collects more insight into this audience. Now, it runs on a global basis, and while there's the ability to cut by region this year, samples smaller at just over 900. We're also going to be drawing on the Ipsos Global Trustworthiness Monitor. This was conducted by Ipsos amongst the general population across 27 countries. Now, all of these sources, they're all global, but the majority of data you're going to see this morning is from Europe. And as I walk through this morning's presentation, what I'll do is I'll pull in some global insights, some regional and some country-specific insights as well. There's also a couple of other reports that I'm going to reference, but look, let's get into trust now and why we're actually looking at this. I mean, of course, there's good reason. I think this quote here from Stephen Covey, I think it helps to sum it up pretty nicely. And just thinking about me personally, trust affects all aspects of my life. It affects who I'm friends with, who I do business with, where I consume content from, the brands I consume. It even affects things such as who I'm going to vote for. And if you want to be building trust with global business influencers, have them invest their money with you, or get them to buy your latest watch, you have to have their trust. It's so important. And of course, if you want them to consume and engage with your content, then they have to trust the media brand in which it exists. I think The thing is, though, with trust at the moment, there's so much going on in the world around it. The perception is that trust is under pressure, and there's narrative around that we're in this crisis of trust and that it's being eroded in institutions, the media, and the government. And it's because of this that Ipsos has recently done lots of work on trust, and it's at a global level amongst the general population with the objective to test this narrative of a crisis in trust. And what we found is in this work that, look, it's complicated. And that, for instance, trust in politicians, it's always been very low. And actually that trust in traditional media is increasing, while trust in digital and the internet is decreasing. So sweeping statements around things like a crisis of trust, I think that we really need to be taking those with a pinch of salt and looking at a bit more detail underneath the surface. And it's this morning that we want to showcase work that we've done in this area to better understand the global business influencers and their views on trust. But first, I suppose when we talk about trust, what do we mean? And the thing is that trust it's a tricky concept, okay? Academia have been debating it for years. So what Ipsos has done is they've pulled together all the main components that appear in academic models. And for the purposes of this morning, it's trustworthiness that we'll focus on. And these are the traits that drive trust. And when we think about traits, there's three areas that they fall into. Okay, the first one is basic trust. It's all about competency and reliability. I'm sure there's a few people in the room that feel the same as me about dentists. I'm not very keen on them. So when I go to my dentist, I want to ensure that, look, they're competent. I don't want them pulling healthy teeth out of my mouth. And this is what all this is about. It's achieving that basic level of trust. And when we've got that, the next consideration is whether the party's going to treat me well. Do they have my well-being in mind when they make decisions or conduct affairs? And this is called active trust. So it's about, I suppose it's a more meaningful level of trust, you could say. It's the avoidance of acting with one's own self-interest. So going back to my dentist, that if they showed little motivation other than getting my money, I'm going to be less inclined to trust them. The third level is interactive trust. It moves trust from these, I suppose, what we could call fairly functional aspects to a very, very human set of characteristics. A lot of this ties in with integrity. So again, going back to the dentist example, if my dentist is recommending I have a filling when I don't need one, they might not be acting with the best of intentions. So look, these 7 drivers that we see here, this is what we're going to be focusing on in part of this morning's presentation, and they're taken from the Ipsos Global Trustworthiness Monitor. So in terms of what we did next, we first of all asked the global business influencers to rate how trustworthy or untrustworthy they thought different organisations or institutions were. So areas we looked at included the government, tech companies, financial institutions, and of course the media. Secondly, we then asked them about those 7 drivers, and we asked them which were most important when it came to deciding whether or not to trust an organisation. And then lastly, we asked them about the level of agreement for those 7 drivers by specific organisation. So do they think tech companies are responsible, well-led, good at what they're meant to be doing, etc. And I think it's at this point, it's probably worth noting that compared to the Ipsos Trustworthiness Monitor, we adapted our questions for GBI. So first of all, we asked about them through a business lens. Secondly, we also, while we kept some of the organisations common that we asked about, we added in some more B2B specific organisations, such as logistics companies and consultancies. I suppose on the next chart, what I thought it might be quite interesting to show you first was some general population data that's taken from the Ipsos Global Trustworthiness Monitor. And it's actually probably pretty relevant for the GBI, given that they're the people actually running these companies. I think the first point to make is that amongst the general population, levels of trustworthiness, they vary. So out of these 4 categories, none in Europe are seen as trustworthy by a majority in Europe. But I think what's worth noting on this is there's very high levels of neither nor here, okay? And this could be due with the concept of trustworthiness rather than trust. It's complex, It's also difficult to answer about. Organisations might not be sharing enough information for them to judge whether or not they deserve their trust. And versus global numbers here, the big difference in Europe is in finance, okay? Globally, trustworthiness levels amongst finance are about 25%. Here in Europe, it's much, much lower. But the thing is that this is just a selection that I've taken that correspond with what we've looked at on GBI. If we look at other sectors around the world, for some sectors, trust is rising. So it's not falling everywhere. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point, we have heaps more information on this as well in Ipsos. So if you want more, just let us know. So moving away from the general population, going back to GBI, how do these trust levels compare to that of global business influencers? If we look at the GBI in Europe, I think the first thing to note is there's a much larger proportion of rating these sectors as trustworthy. In terms of what's driving this, I think we should remember that, look, we've asked them to think about this through a business lens. And given how close they are to these sectors, many are going to be working with them on a daily basis. They're going to be more knowledgeable about what's going on in these companies. And this was reflected in a lower number of neither nor answers and a higher proportion rating them as very trustworthy. And what we can next do, we can introduce global data as well. And the European GBI overall, they're the least trusting out of all regions on GBI. We're a sceptical bunch here in Europe. And I think many of if just looking at financial institutions here, many of them are going to have had first-hand experience of the dot-com bubble. They've been through global recession. They've had the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis as well to deal with. And it's a similar story to that we saw in the general population, with much less saying that financial institutions were trustworthy. We can also highlight data from other regions as well. I'm just going to pull out one data point from Africa here as well, so you can see how it varies. Trust in the government is much less there. I suspect this is probably to do with concern around corruption in more emerging economies. Next, what we can do is we can revisit those 7 trustworthiness drivers. So we asked the GBI what they felt was important in deciding whether or not to trust an organisation. And look, while there's a bit more differentiation between the top 4 and the bottom 3, I think what this chart shows us is that trust, it's very, very complex, okay? It's affected by, I think, every aspect of an organisation's values, their behaviour and their performance. You could say it's a multifaceted concept. You can't just reduce it to a simple model of 1 or 2 factors. And taking this a step further, what we can also do is we can look at how specific sectors are performing against these drivers as well. And what this can do is it can lead us to look at any gaps that may exist here. And what we've done on this is we've looked at the consultancies, as consultancy firms as an example. They're a big area for B2B marketing communications. And I think generally what we're seeing on here is they're doing a pretty good job. Especially in, I suppose, those areas of basic trust, being good at what you say you're going to do and being good at it as well. There's companies focus on responsibility, doing stuff with the best of intentions as well. The thing that GBI in Europe least associate with consultancy firms, and for that matter, many other sectors, is this sharing my values here. And I think compared to the previous chart, this is perhaps one area where there's a little bit of a gap, okay? So when it comes to communications, it's not just about connecting with the goals of a business. You need to be connecting with individuals as well. And what better way to do that than by demonstrating that you share their values? So if you're working in this sector, or within people in this sector, why not think about dialing up areas such as brand purpose in content and communications, as this is a great way to connect with people at an individual level. And one of the big drivers of trust we saw come out was that of acting responsibly. And the principles of ESG talk directly to it, as well as to things like good intentions, transparency, and of course openness as well. And I think given the focus around this area, it's probably pretty good. It's probably a pretty good way to connect with people at an individual level as well. And this quote from Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, he helps to underline the importance of it. But it's all well and good me showing a quote here and saying its importance. But so we actually asked the GBI about different areas of ESG. And what we can see is that a fairly large number of those in Europe, they're stating it's important when it comes to considering investing or working with other companies. So I think people need to be talking about this. They need to be building this up. And what we can also see is that there's just under 2/3 of them are implementing an ESG strategy. It's a little lower than the previous chart, so maybe a small gap. But elsewhere, what we saw was between those who think they should be implementing and those who actually are, the gap was much, much bigger in Asia and the US. But I think there's so much focus around ESG at the moment. We need to be doing more and more in this area. And in terms of areas we should be dialing up, looking at the environment first for the European GBI, energy usage was top everywhere. Pollution and CO2 emissions, they're much, much more unique for Europe. And looking at social, inclusivity was very important everywhere. Interestingly, in the US, it was more about community projects. And in terms of governance, it's thinking about conflict of interest, opportunities to have your say. And in everywhere apart from Europe, we also saw accurate and transparent accounting methods come out. But it was viewed as less important in Europe. Maybe there's more already being done on that here. So look, as I've mentioned, there are differences by region. I think it's important to bear that in mind when you're speaking with these people. And I think this is a great example of how a company has embedded ESG. Victor's they're a private aviation company. And for each flight that you book with them, they offset the carbon emissions by no less than 200%. And you can even pay more to increase that offset. They're also employing some pretty smart tech, such as like flight planning algorithms, and they calculate they calculate better flight routes to reduce fuel burn and in turn carbon emissions as well. So as I mentioned, there's some quite smart technology being used to get ahead here, and this nicely segues me into technology. And I suppose the thing is with tech, we've always been a little bit wary about trusting technology. And this is a picture here. This is a picture of the Stockton to Darlington Railway. And when it opened in 1825, it was the first railway to use steam trains in the world. Now, again, people were a bit wary of it because they believed when these trains hit 80 miles an hour that their bodies would just melt. Okay. Now, of course, that didn't happen and everything was fine and steam trains progressed with speed. But now where we are, we're in the fourth industrial revolution. It's fundamentally changing the way how we live, how we work, and how we all relate to one another. And what this is creating, it's creating this term that Rachel Botsman coined called the trust leap. And it occurs when we take a risk to do something new or different from the way that we've always done it. And with the rapid development of technology, it's enabling us to leap faster and higher than ever before. And the GBI, they're right at the forefront of this. Tech advancements is cited as the biggest challenge they face in their business. And tech, you can see, is omnipresent across innovation and cybersecurity as well. And if we just look at their areas of priority for tech here as well, I think we asked this question in 2017 to this audience, and what it shows us is it hasn't changed that much. At a global level, it's still about legacy modernisation and cybersecurity, and those things filter through for the European GBI. In the US, it was more about legacy modernisation and IT infrastructure. In Asia, it was quite different. We saw things like AI, big data. They were much higher up the priority scale here. But look, I mean, just looking at this, it's complex. There is masses going on. So going back to that trust leap thing, the GBI, they're having to take bigger and bigger trust leaps every day. And look, staying on tech priorities, it's quite interesting to look at these elsewhere as well. So specifically looking at Africa here. Africa's a mobile first, and it's reflected in their priorities. So of course, you need things like IT infrastructure in place. But it's all more focused on the wireless-based products and app economy, those things that talk to getting more out of mobile devices. But going back to Europe, how is this focus on tech impacting tech budgets. Now on GBI we measure loads of different business decision making areas, over 30, and you can look at budget spends within those. And what I've done is I've just pulled out three spend areas for tech, and this is from 2018 we're looking here. What we see comparing to 2019, there are big changes. There's big increases in budgets, and these increased areas, they reflect cyber security for IT security products, and also this legacy modernization as well. It's getting data from servers in the basement up into the cloud. So there's big budgets in. If you're a tech company and you want to be in the running for some of these budgets, what do you need to be thinking about to drive trust? Now, to do this, we took our trust analysis a step further. So as well as asking people what they thought was driving trust in an organization, we also carried out a statistical analysis to uncover what factors were really associated with driving different levels of trust. And what we can see here is that there's these basic traits coming through for technology companies. Doing what you say you're going to do and keeping your promises. However, there's more of these active traits. Behaving responsibly here came through as a really strong factor. And many tech companies, they've grown rapidly, and with this has come the need to demonstrate responsible behaviour. The last area I suppose I was keen to explore was trust in media. I don't need to tell you all here that, look, we live in a world where there's an overwhelming amount of information. Those words fake news reverberate around the room. There's heaps of opinion, there's loads of conjecture. And what's happening as well in the media world is it's generating two two narratives. The first one is that this explosion of content from the internet is driving increased conversations in the industry around the decreased relevance of more traditional or established media. But then on the flip side, what we're seeing is that there's lots of focus on digital and also on social platforms too. For instance, the reliability of information affecting levels of trust. And it's those two areas we're keen to explore a little bit more in this area. But I suppose, first of all, just keen to touch on this. I'm sure many of you have seen these latest headlines from the latest Edelman results. And looking at this in detail, trusted media here is at a 7-year high. Okay, the percentage of people who are saying that they rely on it as a credible source of information, it stands at 65%. This is a similar level to search. In contrast, social media is the least trusted in this. Now, of course, this is general population stuff. So how does this fare amongst global business influencers? When we look at amongst the European global business influencers, overall levels of trust, they're much higher than levels of distrust, especially in those areas of the media they use and established media. But again, as we saw previously, it's the European GBI who are least trusting of media versus their global counterparts. And it's especially true in social media. I can also put in a couple of data points from the UK here as well. And this gap between established media and social, it's even bigger here within the UK. And I'm next going to take a couple of these data points and compare it to that of the general population data taken from the Reuters Institute Digital News Report. And what we can see is that trust levels in overall media and the media they use, they're much, much higher for global business influencers. Now, hypothesizing why this might be, Ipsos did some work amongst the general population, and it looked at trust levels amongst those more educated people. And what they found is that trust levels were higher amongst those more educated people. I think potentially it suggests a greater self-confidence in ascertaining what they believe to be true or not. And maybe given the positions that the GBI holds here, we're seeing this theory being supercharged and almost taken to the next level. Just adding to it a little bit, if we look just amongst the GBI audience at those people who are C-suite and non-C-suite, we see higher levels of trust amongst those higher C-suite levels. Now I'm going to come back to trust in the chart but one. But on this chart, I really wanted to make the point, first of all, that the GBI, they continue to consume a massive amount of content from a variety of sources. And what we've done is we've looked at yesterday reach between 16 and 2019. And yes, of course, there's no getting away from it. Digital is high, but print is fairly stable, a slight decrease. TV's even gone up a couple of percentage points. So it's really important to remember this when you're trying to reach this audience. Use a variety of platforms to reach them. But of course, it's all about knowing which brand and platform works best with your audience. And there's this, I thought I'd reference this recent work done by the World Media Group called Quality Benchmarks. It looked at the relationship between trusted media brands and viewability rates. And what it showed is that trust levels in media brands, it had a direct impact on the quality of engagement with communication. So viewability rates for display advertising, they went up in those more trusted media brands. So it's really important to understand which brands are considered most trustworthy. And we've added new engagement measures onto GBI to help you do this. So as well as understanding which brands your audiences consume, we can also help you to understand whether they're considered to be trustworthy, authoritative, influential, unique, etc. And for each of these engagement metrics that we measure, we ask on a scale of 1 to 7 how much it applies to said brand. And this allows us to then go on and create a score for each media brand, which allows you to identify those which are most trustworthy, for instance, at an overall level, or you could look at this by specific targets. But lastly, if you want to build trust with your media brand, looking at our statistical model for trust, key drivers we identified for trusting media companies, it included sharing their values, ensuring you're keeping your promises, behaving responsibly, and of course, being open and transparent. So look, that's almost it. But in summary, I suppose there's 3 things I'd like to flag. Trust is all-encompassing. All right? It's affected by all aspects of an organisation's values, performance, and their behaviours. There is no silver bullet. And while overall trust levels are higher than that of the general population, they vary by sector and by region. So companies need to be working hard to continue to deliver on those 7 trust drivers. And agencies and media owners, you need to help them communicate what they're doing in these areas to help them build trust with global business influencers. And there's lots of talk of digital, but don't forget that GBI continue to consume a large amount of content across multiple platforms, including print and television. But what varies though is trust, and that's what we've seen this morning, that trust in established media and search rank highly, while it's a different story for areas such as social amongst this audience. Thirdly, look, GBI is growing. We're now in 30 markets, so it's more global, and we're giving you more insight than ever. It's the unparalleled source for understanding B2B audiences. Just on insight quickly, this is the stuff that I've referenced during this from the general population. We've got loads more work done around trust in the general population, so if you want it, let us know. When we send this deck around as well, we'll embed a link into the webpage for this as well, so you can access it through that. I suppose lastly, I'd just like to thank you all for listening. I hope you found this interesting. We do like a questionnaire, and we'd love to have your feedback on what you thought of today so that we can look at how we can make improvements for future talks. So there's questionnaires over there. You can pick one up on your way out. We'll be around to answer any questions. And lastly, don't forget to pick up a brochure on the way out. Thank you all very much for listening.